Welcome to Organizational Communication. In this course, you will learn the 7 communication-related questions that you should ask yourself during every project or major change initiative. These 7 questions will guide your thinking regardless of the sector you work in. In fact, in the course, you're going to hear examples from Scott, who works in education, Carol in healthcare, Ben from nonprofit, and Emily from corporate. With their stories and their lessons learned in your mind, you will practice making strategic communication decisions. You will learn to be the communication advocate for your area. Never let a decision be made without some consideration of the communication implications. Following this course, you can become the resident communication expert for your team. Think of organizational communication as all of the interactions necessary to get a group to accomplish a desired result. When communication is effective, everyone is on the same page. People buy into the vision. The right people have the right information to make the right decisions. It's awesome. But when communication fails, well, that can get ugly. Even if your company has great products and services and talented employees with a strong work ethic, weak organizational communication can undermine all of that. Many researchers argue that communication failure is at least partially responsible for all organizational flops. That's a bold claim, right? But think of the last organizational failure that happened in your company. If you trace back the various reasons for failure of an initiative, I bet you'll find some communication mishaps were part of the problem. And communication-related failures can be costly. When a dispatcher sent an entire fleet of trucks to Portland, Oregon, instead of Portland, Maine, 3,000 miles away from the intended destination, it cost the company $100,000. When a sales manager was so overloaded with email that she failed to forward the new price list to her reps, the company had to eat over $25,000 in profit that could have been theirs. In 1986, when NASA engineers did not persuade management to delay the launch of the Challenger space shuttle because of faulty O-rings, 7 astronauts lost their lives. Miscommunication is prevalent and costly. Can your organization improve its communication? I believe there is room for growth in every organization. And as author Alan Zaremba points out, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to communicate effectively. In fact, as we saw with the Challenger disaster, even if you are a rocket scientist, you aren't guaranteed great results unless communication is a priority. Communication is not a frill. It is as vital to an organization as your heart is to health. Your communication expertise begins by being intentional about communication, rather than treating it as an afterthought at the very end of a project, or worse, after communication problems happen. To be proactive about communication, we need to make it a habit to ask ourselves 7 key questions when faced with any new project or initiative. These 7 questions reflect the variables that exist in every communication event. So what's a communication event? You could be making a sales call, or presenting at a conference, or simply chatting with friends over lunch. Every one of these situations involves communication, and those 7 variables are at work. When we learn to manage these variables, we increase the likelihood of communication success. So, what are these 7 communication questions we need to ask ourselves? I'll overview them now, and then we'll do a deep dive into each. Who should receive this news? Who would be the best sender? What is the bottom line message? How might the message be interpreted? Do we want or need feedback on the message? What is the best channel? How should I time and sequence this message? Are any other context issues important? These 7 questions can transform your communication efforts if you make it a habit to ask them. Let's do an assessment of a communication event in your company using these key questions. Think of a message that was supposed to be communicated widely within your organization. It could be anything: a new phone system being installed, or a new process for requesting travel reimbursements. Select a situation that seems fairly typical of the communication in your workplace. Now, in the exercise file, assess your company on its communication effectiveness. First, who were the receivers or the people who heard the news? Did the right people get the message in your situation? One of the leading communication problems is assuming that everyone who needs to get a message actually got that message. When we take the time to identify each party who should receive a message, we'll avoid this common problem. Next, who is the sender of the message? Was the sender the best person for the job? Why or why not? Third, what was the intended message? Did people get enough, but not too much information? Did they know what they were supposed to do in response to the message? Fourth, how was the message interpreted? Do you think that you and all of the other receivers heard the message in the same way? Did it mean the same thing to all of you? Did the sender clarify any aspects of the message that might have caused confusion or emotional upset? Getting senders and receivers to align their thinking is one of the most challenging aspects of communication. Next, how did the message get from the sender to the receiver? Or what was the channel of communication? Was it an email, a one-on-one, a large group meeting, maybe a notice on your intranet, or a blurb in the newsletter? What would have been the best way to get the message from point A to point B? Later in our course, we'll look at specific criteria you can use to determine the best communication channel. Our 6th question is about feedback. Were receivers asked to share their thoughts on the message? If people did give feedback, did anyone respond to the feedback? Or was communication pretty much one way? Feedback allows us to make sure that the message was received and understood the way that we had hoped. Finally, let's consider context. In your communication event, would there have been a bad time to communicate the news? When would have been the best time? Did location or relationship affect the message? So how did your organization do? You can think of another message that needed to be communicated at your departmental or team level and assess that event using the same questions. Did you have more success with a smaller group? What areas received the lowest scores? Is that typical? As we explore each of the 7 key areas, you'll find it helpful to work through each movie in a sequential order, but plan to really focus in on those sections where your organization needed the most improvement. Now that we've covered the 7 key areas, make it a habit to ask these questions of yourself and of others nearly every day. As we move through the course, you can create a communication action plan which will help you apply all the things we're talking about to a real situation that you're facing. The action plan will help you understand and remember our 7 key questions, and it will help you prepare for something that's on your to-do list anyway. Let's get started by opening the exercise file titled Communication Action Plan. Describe a current project or initiative you're a part of that will require communicating with others. I'm redesigning the curriculum for a required course at the university where I teach. That could be my focus. Maybe you're on a technical team that will present a recommendation to management next month. Or perhaps you'd like to get your entire department to socialize more to build team relationships. Any project that involves other people and is important to you will be a good one for you to work with. We'll return to this action plan after each chapter, so by the end of the course, you'll have your communication strategy ready to go. We begin our plan by thinking through our communicative purpose. For example, as a result of this course, I hope you will have a deep understanding of organizational communication. I hope you will ask those 7 key questions regularly. I hope you and I become a part of one another's professional network. My hopes demonstrate the 3 primary reasons we communicate in the workplace: to inform, to influence, and to build relationships. Influence is the most common reason we communicate at work. We want people to meet a deadline, take action, send us information, share ideas. But even when your message is intended to inform, like this course, there's often an action you expect as a result of that information. I may be informing you of the 7 key questions in this course, but I want you to actually use the 7 questions as well. Some communication is for the purpose of relationship building. We chat with people to get to know them, to build trust, to have fun, all of which improve the climate of the workplace. Your intent may be simple, something like get a colleague to stop leaving moldy food in the refrigerator. Or your intent may be complex, create a corporate climate where employees embrace change. Regardless of your intention, always begin your communication efforts by determining your purpose. Let's add your intended purpose to your communication plan now. If everything turned out perfectly in your project, what would people know or do or feel that they don't right now? That's your ideal outcome or your purpose. Whenever you communicate about your project, keep that purpose in mind. Once you know your purpose, make a list of all the people who should be involved in the project or should know about your work. A student of mine recently came to me with an idea for a new app that would be great for one of my courses. We met several times and put hours into the project. Then it dawned on me, I haven't run this idea by my director. When I did, she had some serious concerns about student privacy issues, and we ended up tabling the idea. If I had made a list of stakeholders first, I could have saved so much time. Let me introduce you to Carol, a nurse in a neonatal unit at a local hospital. Carol's unit always makes the health and safety of the babies the #1 goal. But they also realize how important it is to be sensitive to the needs of the parents. Carol has done extensive research on ways to help parents through the stress of a hospital stay, and she would like for her department to begin using webcams in the rooms so that parents can monitor their babies even while off-site. When Carol made her list of receivers, she considered who would make the decision, who can tell her yes or no about webcams. She thought about people who influence those decision makers. She thought of all the people who would need to take some sort of action for approval and implementation to happen. She thought of people inside and outside of her unit and of the hospital that need to be in the loop. She also thought of those who might be most resistant to her plan and made sure to keep them in mind. Carol thought about all the directions in which communication travels to make sure her list was complete. We need downward communication, that is, messages that flow from the top levels of management to the employees throughout the company. Downward communication is most common, but can become distorted if passed through too many people. Try to communicate directly to as many receivers as possible. Upward communication allows management to learn about problems that only frontline people are privy to. When channels are in place for employees to be heard by their leadership, they feel more valued. Upward communication is notorious, though, for being skewed toward the positive. No one wants to give the boss bad news, and no one wants to confess when things aren't going well. So upward messages tend to suffer from a positivity bias. You can use opinion surveys, Q&A sessions, advisory boards, ombudsmen, hotlines, suggestion boxes, skip level interviews, anything you can think of to encourage upward, honest communication in your company. Horizontal communication is often overlooked. Yet that dreaded silo mentality begins to grow when departments or units see themselves as independent actors rather than part of a collective system. If you notice a lack of lateral communication, you can initiate conversations with people at your level in other departments. Consider a once-a-week coffee or even just a quick drop-by to chat about current projects. Powerful collaborations often begin as simple conversations. Carol, our baby nurse, has her list of receivers looking pretty good. Have you started thinking of who you should have on your list? There's one more group to consider. Who might be an unintended audience? Emails are so easy to forward. Remember in July of 2008 when Steve Jobs wrote a message intended for Apple employees, admitted that the launch of MobileMe was rushed. That message got forwarded to the public, and next thing you know, Apple ended up giving MobileMe users 2 free months of subscription. As communicators, we want our message to be received by the intended audience, and we need to be aware of unintended audiences. So think carefully about who could end up hearing your message. Let's practice identifying receivers. Say you've decided to go on vacation. Who are all the receivers you need to consider? Pause here and write down your list. What's your list look like? When my husband and I decide to go on vacation, we need to talk to my boss, his boss, my students, my business partner, my mom, the house sitter, the pet sitter, our kids, the newspaper carrier, our travel agent, and more. Over a half dozen people just to leave town for a few days. Were you surprised at the length of your own list? Take another look at the receivers you've added to your communication action plan. Are you missing anyone? We're looking for everyone who might need to hear your message. That's up the chain of command, down the chain, sideways, internal, external. Being a strategic communicator means planning out who should get certain messages so that we won't forget any important stakeholders. I want you to give some serious thought to the best senders of your message. Your sender should be influential to the receivers. What is it to be influential? The ancient Greeks would explain it this way. When Aeschines speaks, the people say, "How well he speaks." But when Demosthenes speaks, the people say, "Let's march." Demosthenes is our influencer here, someone who can change the actions of others. What makes a person influential and a good candidate for sending messages? People generally influence us if they have some kind of power in our eyes, and that power falls into 5 categories. Legitimate power happens when people comply with a request because the sender has a certain title or position. Let's face it, sometimes we do what the boss says because the boss is the boss. We respect the position and demonstrate that respect through compliance. Reward power refers to behavior motivated because a sender can reward you in some way. You follow up quickly with a request from a potential client because he has the power to reward you with new business. Or just the opposite, coercive power happens when a sender can punish you in some way or take away good things in life. You follow up quickly with an existing client because he has the power to take his business elsewhere. People are influenced by expert power when a sender really knows her stuff. Why not follow an expert, right? And finally, referent power is influence that happens as a result of credibility or similarity. I had a student a few years ago, Jason, who was terrified of public speaking. He came into my office several times seeking suggestions to deal with his anxiety. Each time, I would give him some ideas, and he'd tell me why none of those ideas would work for him. He was not influenced by me, even though I had legitimate power, I'm his prof. I had reward and coercive power, because I assign grades, and I had expert power, because I've done a ton of research in this area. Yet, we just weren't making any progress. One day, in utter frustration, Jason said, "You know what, Professor H? You just don't get it because you aren't afraid." It finally hit me. I don't have credibility with this kid. So I asked, "Would you be willing to work with another student who also used to be terrified of public speaking?" At this point, poor Jason said, "Sure, whatever." So I called up this other student and explained the situation. She met with Jason, and do you know that within a week, Jason was strutting up in front of an audience, oozing confidence. I called my former student and said, "Oh my gosh, you're a genius. What did you tell Jason? Because it worked." She started explaining all of her strategies, and don't you know, they were exactly what I had already recommended. Jason responded to her, though, because he could identify with her. That's referent power. These 5 power categories are not absolute. Rather, influence is situational. Don't make the mistake of assuming that you are the best sender of your message. If someone else could be more effective, pass the torch. Focus on your purpose. And if enlisting someone else to be a spokesperson of your idea would help give the idea wings, go for it. Tap into the influence that will work. Let's experiment with these power categories. In the exercise file called Practice Activities, write down 3 or 4 recent times when someone has influenced you to take a certain action. Now let's consider the possible reasons for your willingness to be influenced. Checkmark all that apply. Check legitimate if the sender has a certain title or position that you responded to. Reward if the sender could reward you. Coercive if you were worried that the person would punish you or make life difficult if you failed to comply. Expert if you were influenced because the sender really knows her stuff. Referent if there is just something about this person that resonates with you and earned your trust. Now return to your communication action plan and start identifying the best senders for each of your receivers. Who are the most influential messengers for your project? Arnold Red Auerbach, legendary basketball coach, was fond of saying, "It's not what you tell players, it's what they hear that counts." The same is true of our receivers. Now that we've identified who should hear our message, we must remember that these people will interpret our message to understand its meaning. See the lines drawn through the heads of the senders and receivers? These little lines remind us that no listener is an empty vessel awaiting our message. Rather, people have mental filters. We all have preconceived notions, assumptions, biases, good and bad, our unique way of seeing the world. Your receivers have their own perspectives about you and your message. These mental filters can skew how our message is heard and understood. Our third key communication question is, how might my message be interpreted? Let's consider a few examples. I send a memo to remind John about an upcoming safety meeting. How might John interpret my message? He might think, Brenda doesn't trust me to remember anything. Or, safety is important around here. Or, isn't that nice? Brenda is being helpful in trying to ease my burden. Now, this example from the Emotional Intelligence Activity Book cautions us that even a simple reminder email is subject to interpretation. The relationship I have with John, his state of mind when reading my email, and my specific word choice can all affect the meaning for John. If I'm mindful of the possible interpretations, I can clarify my intent by adding one extra line to that email. Something like, I know your plate is really full right now, just wanted to be helpful. Consider another example. Jake's son got a C on a spelling test he took today. While the results were not what Jake had hoped for, especially after hours of practice with his son, the C is better than the D from last week. Jake says, "Good work, son." How might his son interpret this message? He might hear it as intended, a sincere compliment. But he might hear it as a veiled insult or disappointment. Depending on the relationship Jake has with his son's sensitivity, and Jake's propensity for sarcasm, do you see how the message might go through his son's mental filter and get misconstrued? Be vigilant about watching for nonverbal feedback, for clues about how someone is taking your message. If Jake's son lights up and smiles, we know we have communication success. If he slumps his shoulders, walks away, and mutters whatever, we probably have a miscommunication here. Mental filters are the source of far too many misunderstandings, but by being thoughtful and proactive, you can help overcome this common communication barrier. My friend Emily gives us a great example of mental filters. Emily is the training and development director at a bank. The bank instituted a secret shopper program about 3 years ago. Now, over the last few months, the scores on the secret shopper reports have declined, not a lot, but the leadership wants to be proactive. They realize that many of the new tellers weren't even working here back when they did some customer service training and started the secret shopper program. The leadership team contacted Emily and asked her to create and conduct mandatory customer service training for every teller at the bank. Now take a moment and imagine being a teller who is told that you must attend customer service training. How are you likely to interpret this message? How might you respond? Emily was empathetic enough to realize that her message might create an emotional response in people. People could hear her message to mean, you think I'm bad at my job, or you blame us, the tellers, for every problem the bank has. In addition to imagining their responses, Emily actually chatted with a few tellers and quickly learned that there were going to be 3 major interpretations or responses to the training. The new tellers were actually pretty excited about the training. The more experienced tellers were far less excited because they felt it would be a waste of their time. After all, they already had training a few years ago. And finally, she realized that some people were just happy to get paid and not have to go to work. Knowing these 3 filters exist allows her to make much better decisions about her communication efforts. Let's practice one more way of identifying possible mental filters. Go to your email and open the last 2 or 3 emails you sent. What was your intended message? Who was the receiver? How might your reader have interpreted your message? Was there anything you could have said to clarify your intended meaning? Now that you've practiced thinking about mental filters, let's return to your communication action plan and fill in the possible filters people might have about your project. Whether you are communicating with one person or many, in a personal or professional relationship, internal or external to your company, mental filters can derail our efforts to communicate effectively. Ask yourself, how might my message be interpreted? Let's add a fourth important communication question to our process. What is the bottom line message? We've identified our purpose, so we know the core idea, but we have all of these different receivers with different ways of interpreting the same message, so we must learn to focus and frame the idea carefully. Let's start with focus. Our first task is to identify the bottom line message. What is the one thing your audience must remember when they walk away from your meeting or after they read your memo? I once worked with a CFO who was frustrated after each quarterly analyst call. He felt that what the analyst reported about his company wasn't a good reflection of what he had said during the calls. The picture that the analyst painted of his company was quite cautionary in tone, which can scare away potential investors. While companies who were truly in a much more precarious financial position were described in more positive ways. I listened to the recordings of his calls for the past several years. This brilliant, well-informed financial genius had too much to share. I counted no less than 18 different messages in one 45-minute call. The analysts were on absolute overload when they listened to him, and no one message surfaced as the primary story. So they did their best to summarize his calls, but because the CFO failed to present one core message, the analysts were left to their own devices. They identified the central message when he didn't, and they took the cautious route when doing so. How can you tell if your communication has a core message? A great self-check is to share your intended message with a friend or a colleague and ask the question, what do you think is the most important takeaway from this speech or email or slide deck? If your friend didn't get your bottom line message, go back and simplify. Focus more on the key idea and repeat it more often. Focusing on one key idea is challenging. There is so much we need to communicate. But it's better to successfully communicate one idea than to unsuccessfully attempt to communicate a bunch of ideas. Focus your message on one key idea. Now that we're focused on one central idea, we frame that idea for our intended audience. Consider the audience's knowledge level, possible reactions, and reason for listening. Frame your message to align with the unique needs of your listeners. When we present to executives, for example, we realize that they are most concerned with the big picture and bottom line results. When someone makes a technical recommendation, your CEO needs to know how much it will cost, what the risks are, and what the benefits are. The engineer, who will actually create the solution, has a much different list of needs. Remember Emily, our training director, who has to conduct mandatory training at her bank? She did her homework, talked to people, and found out the different mental filters her receivers were likely to have. This helps her frame her message. She decided to write 2 different emails. One for the more experienced tellers who might not be too thrilled about more customer service training, and a different email for the new hires who actually seem pretty happy about it. Here is Emily sharing her 2 invitations. Her bottom line message stays the same: sign up for training. But notice the differences in how she frames that same message.
We are proud of our customer service and recognize that it is one of our competitive advantages. To keep our A-plus service ratings, we're conducting training for all our tellers. Use the link below to sign up for a one-day training session to be held at corporate headquarters in room 223. Your branch manager has approved all of the dates and times that you will see listed. Dress is casual, and all you need to bring is your enthusiasm. Lunch will be provided. See you next month. The more experienced tellers aren't quite so thrilled. They're concerned that this will be a repeat of what they've already heard a few years ago. So I tried engaging them more in the process like this. We're proud of our customer service and recognize that those of you on the front line are responsible for our A-plus service ratings. To keep our exceptional service levels, we're scheduling time to share best practices and to discuss the most challenging customer issues you encounter. Use the link below to sign up.
In addition to framing her message for the unique needs of her receivers, Emily also realized that an effective message will be a campaign rather than just a one-shot deal. Some marketing experts say that repeating a message 3 times will work, while others live by the rule of 7. A Microsoft study on audio messages concluded that between 6 and 20 repetitions is best. Regardless of the exact number of repetitions or effective frequency, it's pretty clear that once doesn't cut it. Commercials air over and over and over because advertisers know the value of repeating a message. Nike's Just Do It campaign has been used for over 26 years. M&Ms that melt in your mouth, not in your hands, have been around since 1954. So Emily not only sent that initial email invitation that we heard, she called or visited every branch manager and asked them to tell their staff about the training. She put a message about it in the quarterly update. She posted a flyer on all of the break room bulletin boards, and she followed up with a phone call to anyone who hadn't registered for training at least a week before the deadline. Don't give up. If you state your message once and don't feel heard, don't expect everyone to hear, remember, believe, and act on your message because you sent out one email or talked about your idea in one meeting. My bottom line message for you is focus and frame. Focus on your bottom line message, your must remember message. Frame for your unique audience. Focus and frame. Commercials are a great demonstration of how the same core message can be framed differently for different audiences. Look at these 2 different ads promoting the exact same cruise. What differences jump out? Who were the targeted audiences? Amazing, isn't it, that these 2 ads are for the exact same cruise experience? They have the same purpose, book a cruise with us, and the same bottom line message, you'll have fun. But you probably found many ways the message was framed differently for different receivers. When you create a message, an email let's say, do you send the same email to everyone on the list? Or do you find ways to tailor the message as effectively as advertisers do? Let's go to your communication action plan and craft your message. To get your ideas focused, think about that bottom line message for each receiver group you've identified. If they only remember one thing, what do you want it to be? Then, think about framing your message. How can you tailor the bottom line message to make it best fit each different audience? Complete column 4 with your focused and framed message. Feedback is a message about the original message. It takes one-way communication and turns it into two-way communication. There are dangers with one-way communication. One of those dangers is misunderstanding. A manager tells an employee to do a certain task, but then rushes off to a meeting. The employee, without a chance to clarify, misunderstands the task, does it wrong, and creates all sorts of problems. Another danger with one-way communication is low morale. A team is told they have to move to a new location and are given no input into the decision. They feel unvalued and morale sinks. Market alignment can go haywire when companies rely on one-way communication to customers. A company could decide to offer a new product without getting feedback from its consumer base. Millions of research and development dollars later, the project gets scrapped because customers aren't interested. You want to build opportunities for feedback into your organizational communication process to avoid these dangers. But there are dangers in seeking feedback as well. Feedback takes time. Feedback is dangerous if we ask for input but have no intention of addressing concerns or using the shared ideas. Morale sinks even lower if leadership pretends to be listening, but then isn't really responsive. So I've been honest about potential dangers of feedback. It can slow things down, and it creates an expectation that the feedback will be responded to. But at the end of the day, the benefits far outweigh any potential drawbacks. For example, Lululemon, a company that sells yoga apparel, got feedback from store managers saying that a new line of pants were too sheer. Because of that feedback, the company was able to do a recall before a barrage of negative reviews hit social media sites. An improved product is back on the shelf, and the stock price is actually higher than it was before the recall. Internal feedback can be just as beneficial as customer feedback. Google holds fix-its, or problem-solving sessions with employees. In one fix-it session, employees shared 51 different suggestions for how to improve career development. Those ideas were voted on by thousands of other employees, and the 3 top ideas were implemented. A year later, employee satisfaction went up on the annual employee survey, including double-digit increases on the career development questions. The benefits of feedback are undeniable. We would all improve the organizational communication in our companies with two-way communication. Make it a habit when planning your communication efforts to build in that feedback loop. When adding feedback to your communication plan, remember 2 important concepts. First, ask only for feedback that you can use. And 2, use open-ended questions when asking for feedback. To demonstrate these 2 ideas, I'd like to introduce you to Scott. Scott is an elementary teacher at a public school. His principal asked him to chair the redistricting committee. As population shifts in a district, some schools become too crowded, while others sit half empty. The task of the committee is to make recommendations on how to rebalance. Where your child goes to school is an emotionally charged issue. We don't want Scott and his committee to end up facing an angry mob of parents outraged that their children have to move to different schools. Yet the reality is, some children and teachers will have to move schools. How would you coach Scott to build feedback into his communication process? When should he seek feedback? From whom? What questions should he ask? What questions should he not ask? Scott's committee successfully applied our first feedback concept: ask only for information you can use. They held numerous public meetings throughout the project. They had a meeting when determining the criteria for evaluating options. They had another one when weighing the options. They had yet another public meeting focused on making the transition. At each meeting, Scott was very clear about what was and was not up for discussion. For example, at the transition meeting, Scott said this.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. The purpose of this meeting is to explore how we can make the transition as easy as possible for children who will be moving schools. Our last 3 meetings were used to discuss actual district lines, and input on that issue is no longer up for discussion. What ideas do you have for helping the children and teachers who will be asked to move schools?
Now let's imagine a meeting when Scott forgot to use our second important feedback principle: ask open-ended questions. Scott might say,
Okay, we have 5 possible scenarios. To start narrowing down to the best choice, we're going to drive the different bus routes to see how long they take. Dawn, you've got the first 2 routes, and Trudy, you're taking the rest, right?
to which Dawn and Trudy both say, "Yep, sounds good." It's great that Scott is trying to get feedback from his committee members rather than assuming everyone understood their assignments. But I'm worried that his wording was insufficient. He stated the next steps and then asked them, right? Well, you can guess what might happen. When they get back together, Trudy and Dawn realize that they've driven the same routes because Scott didn't thoroughly check for understanding. The committee will have lost valuable time because of a simple misunderstanding that could have been clarified if Scott had asked an open-ended question instead, like this.
To start narrowing down to the best choice, we're going to drive the different bus routes to see how long they take. Dawn, Trudy, would you remind us which routes you each plan to drive?
If Dawn or Trudy were to say, "Yeah, I'm taking the first 2, Scott could ask, "Which are?" With a little probing and open-ended questions, Scott gets an accurate check of what everyone is thinking. To get useful feedback, we must make it a habit to ask open-ended questions that really test the understanding of our conversational partners. Avoid asking, "Right?" or "Do you have any questions?" or even, "Do you understand?" Close-ended questions will not clarify misunderstandings. Open-ended questions are the way to go. Time to think about feedback for your project. In your communication action plan, complete the 5th column. What opportunities for feedback can you build into the communication process? When would it be helpful for you to get feedback? What open-ended questions can you ask? In what ways can you be responsive to that feedback? Remember, two-way communication may slow you down a bit, but the benefits are worth it. Your communication plan is almost complete. We now figure out how to get your message from sender to receiver. What is the best channel? We begin our choice by exploring the richness of each communication media available to us. Richness is measured by whether or not a channel supports immediate feedback, provides verbal and nonverbal cues, and has a personal focus. So, how would you rank the following channels on richness? Phone, video conference, brochure, email, and face-to-face. Did your ranked list look something like this? Face-to-face meets all of the richness criteria. When we meet in person, you get instant feedback. You can see and hear what I have to say. And it's innately personal because we're person to person. Video conferencing, when the technology works well, has many of these same features. We lose the body language and facial expression cues when we move to telephone, and we lose all nonverbal cues, with the exception of emoticons, when we move to text. But individual emails still have a personal focus that brochures lack. Does this mean we should never use email or brochures? Well, of course we will, and we should. The channels that are less rich are still good channels as long as we use them for unambiguous and simple messages. There are other factors to be considered in our channel choice. Need for permanence makes a written document actually better than a face-to-face. Speed and cost also need to be part of our decision. And finally, effect. Your leadership team wants your department to know what an outstanding job they did on a project last week. which channel would have the better effect? A mass email to everyone on the team, or a personal handwritten thank you note to each team member? So we've made an intelligent and informed decision when selecting our channel, our highway for the message. But we may still encounter a few roadblocks in our path. Let's imagine that your HR director needs to communicate a time-sensitive change in the benefits package to all employees. The message starts with a face-to-face visit to the vice presidents, who are in turn to tell departmental directors, who in turn are to tell unit supervisors, who in turn tell their staff. Good plan. Unless one of those directors also had 10 other messages to communicate to her supervisors, who were now on overload. And another director communicated the message, but 2 of the supervisors were on vacation, so didn't pass the message along to their staff. Some staff members don't have a reporting line to any of those vice presidents. You might notice that the communication is all one way, and we've already discussed the dangers of too little feedback. When some employees have heard the message and others haven't, the rumor mill kicks in, as it inevitably will when people experience a communication vacuum. The grapevine, which is the rumor mill, is fascinating. It's an informal network of communication that often moves faster than the formal channels, but isn't always as accurate. Rumors and misinformation can spread rapid fire. We can't dictate an order to stop using the grapevine. Rather, we can attempt to limit its damaging effects by sharing a wealth of information in the formal channels. When people aren't thirsty for information, they're less inclined to participate in rumor spreading. Concede that the rumor mill exists. Attempt to understand its nuances and use it, when appropriate, to supplement the slower, formal channels. Next, we'll look at one very common channel of communication in organizational settings, the meeting. Meetings are a channel that we rely on heavily in the workplace, more so than we might realize. An Australian-based software company estimates that most employees attend 62 meetings per month. Half of the time spent in those meetings is unproductive, leading to their frightful conclusion that you and I are each likely to waste 31 hours this month in meetings. Look at your calendar last month. Are you coming in pretty close to that estimated 62 meetings? I was. Given that we spend so much time in meetings, I want to share 2 tips that will instantly improve the effectiveness of your meetings. Neither one will cost you a dime, and both are quick, easy changes to make. First, make a minor adjustment to your agenda to improve the efficiency of your meetings. Most agendas look something like this: strategy realignment, quarterly sales, regional marketing plans. I suggest that you add an objective to each agenda item, like this: determine next steps for strategy realignment, report quarterly sales, brainstorm regional marketing plans. People prepare and interact differently if they are listening to, brainstorming about, or acting on, deciding on an issue. Let them know in advance what mental space to be in as they enter the meeting. Then, add a time frame to each agenda item. The time frames allow people to gauge how much sharing is appropriate. If you reach the end of the allotted time and the team has not finished that item, you can simply ask, do we want to continue this discussion and eliminate some other agenda item? Or can we, in the next 2 minutes, wrap this up? Teams frequently realize that they are belaboring a point and will choose to wrap up and move on. Suddenly, naysayers are ready for a vote. People full of conversation are ready to be quiet, and you move on. I'm always amazed at how effective this tactic is. Once you have your agenda in order, your other meeting tip is to make sure that all important roles are being filled. This includes information giver, information seeker, initiator, devil's advocate, encourager, facilitator, gatekeeper, and note taker. If you notice that some of these roles are not being filled, you have a few choices. You can step up and fill that role yourself. You can bring the gap to the attention of the team and ask for volunteers for each role. Or you may have to be a bit more creative. I was consulting with a team that lacked both information seekers and devil's advocates or critics during their meetings. The absence of these roles was creating some fairly serious dysfunction on the team. When I asked for volunteers, several hands shot up for information seeker, but no one wanted to play the role of the critic. So we put all the roles on index cards, shuffled them up, and drew for roles. The facilitator continued this approach at the start of every weekly staff meeting for nearly 3 years when he retired. Maybe the team still draws for roles, I don't know, but I do know it worked for them and created robust discussions during their meetings. Improve your agenda and get those roles assigned to make the most of one of our most used channels. A communication flow diagram is a useful tool to help you analyze if the right people are getting the right messages. A flow diagram charts the intended path of a message and the actual path of a message. Think of a recent message in your organization that was intended for a broad audience. Chart the intended path. Then, chart what actually happened to the best of your knowledge. I use this tool when I consult with organizations. After I map out intended and actual charts for several communication efforts, leaders quickly grasp where their bottlenecks, overloads, dead zones, and one-way communication spots are, and they begin making important changes. A few pieces of paper, a couple of colored pencils, and a little time, and you can be your own communication consultant. Take some time and try it now. With the insights from your diagrams in mind, return to your communication action plan and complete the 6th column with a channel choice that is based on the need for richness, permanence, speed, cost, and best effect. You are now in the home stretch with just one important variable left to discuss. You are down to one final question to ask yourself as you craft your communication action plan. What context issues should you consider? All of the variables, senders, receivers, message, feedback, are affected by the context. That's the situation surrounding your communication event. For example, imagine going to a meeting at 2 in the afternoon. You had a heavy lunch, the conference room temperature is just a little warm, and you're feeling very sleepy. Now, you've never met the presenter at the meeting before. And right before you walked into the meeting, you got a call from your friend canceling your dinner plans tonight. So you're bummed. All of these situational issues can affect your perception of the speaker and your overall interaction. Compare that meeting to one that you attend when you're wide awake, feeling happy, in an office that routinely has productive, efficient meetings, and you're good friends with the presenter. The new situation changes everything. As communicators, we certainly don't control all the contextual variables at play. I can't help it that your friend canceled dinner, but we should manage those that are within our control. Timing and location are two parts of the context we often can control. If you need to give an employee some critical feedback, it may be convenient for you to stop him in the hallway right after the staff meeting, because you're both there anyway. But convenience is not a good rationale for a context decision. If others can overhear your conversation, you risk making that employee feel humiliated or defensive. Organizational climate is part of the context mix and causes 15% of communication problems, according to the Zaremba study. Climate is the emotional tone of an organization. It's a sense of how comfortable people feel with one another and the company. A supportive climate will encourage interaction and flow of communication, while a defensive climate will slow the flow. So, how do we create a supportive climate? Professor Redding, a pioneer in the organizational communication field, identified 5 conditions necessary for a supportive climate: supportive, credible, open, participative, and emphasizes goals. Evaluate your organization on these 5 dimensions of supportive climate. In the practice activities exercise file, write one action you could take this week to boost each factor even a little bit. For example, when Carol, our neonatal nurse, wanted to incorporate webcams into her unit, she felt supported because her manager was not just willing but eager to hear her ideas. Supportiveness happens when communication with others builds our personal worth. Carol knew to protect her credibility, her trustworthiness, so she shared a report even though it had some negative findings about webcams in hospitals. We build a positive climate when information is believable. The director of Carol's unit had some serious concerns about the webcams and was honest in sharing those concerns with Carol. Openness happens when people communicate honestly with one another and share what they think. Despite her misgivings, the director opened the conversation to others, including parents, the information technology unit, and the legal department. All of their voices were a part of the final decision. People feel good about organizations where their communication influences decisions. And Carol never lost sight of the top priorities of her unit. The goals were brought up in every conversation related to the webcams. Drive positive climate by communicating a commitment to organizational goals. Ethical communication is one of the surest paths to a positive climate. We'll look at ethical communication choices next. Ethical questions surround communication. Is it ever okay to lie? Is a lie of omission still a lie? When you anticipate and report best case scenario, is that hopeful and therefore ethical, or is it exaggeration and unethical? Is strategic ambiguity, that's the practice of being intentionally vague to avoid responsibility, is it unethical, or is it just savvy business practice? How much information should you share to stay on the right side of the ethics line? What do you do when confidentiality and transparency clash? Answers may seem easy while these are just hypothetical questions, but when we face real situations, the decisions can become challenging. As an example, what would you do if you were in Scott's shoes? Do you remember Scott? He's chairing the school committee which determines which students must move schools. Scott has received ugly voicemails on his phone, he's lost sleep getting ready for the public meetings, and now this from his very best friend.
Hey Scott, sounds like your committee is narrowed to 2 options. They're both good options, but you know my son would be affected by one of those plans, and Scott is going to kill us to have to move him to a new school. You know the struggles he's had fitting in, and things are finally clicking for him. Man, I hate to put you in a bad spot, but please push for the option that won't mess us up. Would you do that?
The ethical questions flood poor Scott now. What should he say right now in the moment to his friend? Is it ethical to push for the option that helps his friend? Should he tell his committee about his conflict of interest? Is this a conflict of interest? And what about Carol? She found that one report that said webcams created legal problems one time in one hospital. Does she really have to include that one incident in her communication with the decision makers, even when she has so many other examples of the webcams having great results? These are tough, right? And life can hit you with 1,000 more. What do you do when one of your employees is about to be laid off, but your management team has asked you to keep the information confidential? Does it change your mind if that employee is about to make an offer on a new house? What do you do when your team wants to massage the language to make your product sound less risky or more reliable than it actually is? Is it unethical to fan the flames of the rumor mill when negative but false information about a competitor is spreading? With so many ethical dilemmas possible, how can you make good choices? Let me share just a couple of tips. First, remember that a positive communication climate requires credibility and openness. So use these two pillars when you face communication ethics questions. Secondly, think ahead of the types of ethics situations you're likely to face. Take a moment now to brainstorm at least 5 or 10 ethically questionable communication situations you could encounter. Researchers at Northwestern University discovered that people are less likely to lie if they have a conversation about their ethical decision first. This is true even if the truth meant the people get paid less during an experiment. Preemptive thought and conversation helps us stand our moral ground. So take some time now to consider how you will communicate if faced with any of these ethical situations you brainstormed. Keep these important ethical considerations in mind, especially if your organization is ever faced with a crisis. We'll explore crisis communication next. A crisis is a unique context that I hope you never face. But if a crisis were to happen in your organization, I want you to be ready with great communication strategy. A crisis is any unforeseen event that can damage your company's performance and reputation. Are you prepared for a product failure that creates tons of backlash? How would you handle a viral video of an employee driving a company vehicle while intoxicated? How about a major security breach, a discrimination claim against your CEO? We need to be ready for the unpredictable. Spend a few minutes now making a list of the 10 or 20 most likely crises in your business. Brainstorm economic, informational, physical, human resources, reputational, and even natural disaster possibilities. Then walk through our list of 7 key questions. Determine all of the stakeholders, employees, victims, families, local and regulatory officials, the media. Choose the best sender. This may not be your CEO. If facts are still uncertain, or your CEO doesn't have extensive press briefing experience, you may be better off with your PR person up front, at least at first. Your receivers will likely fall into one of 4 mental filter categories. Supporters who think highly of your organization and will defend you during a crisis. Straddlers who just aren't sure yet what to think of you. Skeptics, they lean towards not supporting you. And the haters. You don't need to win over supporters, and you're unlikely to win over the haters. So focus on messages most pertinent to your straddlers and your skeptics. We've discussed the need to focus your message. And when your message may be reduced down to a headline or a 30-second soundbite on the evening news, you must have your bottom line message clearly articulated and upfront. What types of feedback would be helpful to your team as they move forward? How do you solicit the feedback that you can use? What channels would be most appropriate for various stakeholders? Allow me to introduce you to Ben. Ben faced an industry crisis and prevented a total disruption of business with some smart communication. Ben works for a not-for-profit trade association for ski owners and resorts in the Alpine area. The main goal for Ben's team is to promote growth in the ski industry. In the late 90s, Sonny Bono and Michael Kennedy were both killed in tragic skiing accidents. Two high-profile people die within 5 days of one another. You know the public begins to feel skeptical about the safety of skiing. How can Ben and his team prevent a sharp decline in tourists to the slopes? How can they reassure people? Well, Ben is hypothetical, but this scenario and the response of the National Ski Areas Association are quite real. The association managed this crisis with a brilliant communication approach that was only possible by planning ahead. Within 2 hours of the second fatality, they had faxed 9 pages of information to the media and to member resorts, proving that accident rates continued to be steady, even declining. They had contact information for a university researcher who backed up their claim and was a more objective source, so a very credible sender. Because of their excellent communication, the industry weathered this potential disaster with hardly a dip in performance. Will you be as prepared when the unforeseen hits home? I hope so. Now that you understand our final question, what context issues should you consider? Let's finalize your communication action plan. I hope our conversation has convinced you of the importance of ethical communication. The International Association of Business Communication developed a code of ethics for business communicators like yourself. Find the code in your practice activities exercise file and take a look at each of the 12 standards. How is your organization, or how are you doing on each one? What steps could you take to improve your lowest scores on this code? Are there any additions for your specific business? At last, you're ready to finalize your communication action plan. Answer these important questions about context. What else is going on in the world, industry, or company that may affect how the audience will receive your communication? What might be going on in the life of the individual receiver that will affect the message? What is the sequencing of this message? Is it the first time they've heard about the subject matter, or the 40th? What happened before and after any other related communication? When is the best time to communicate? Where is the best location to communicate? What small steps can you take to improve the climate before communicating this message? What ethical considerations might you face when communicating this initiative? In the last column of the plan, write down your actions to manage the context. Congratulations, you've written your first communication plan, but I hope it isn't your last. Each time you begin a new project or sit in on a new committee, I encourage you to walk through our 7 communication questions. Who should receive this news? Who would be the best sender? What is the bottom line message? How might the message be interpreted? Do we want or need feedback on the message? What is the best channel? What context issues are important? Write a simple communication plan as you have during this course and go back to evaluate how well you stick to your plan. Your organization probably has key performance indicators that you track pretty carefully. Maybe that's test scores, patient wait time, revenue growth, or same-store sales. Consider tracking your organizational communication effectiveness as well. How often is communication a part of strategy discussions? Does your organization do periodic communication audits? Do the right people get the right message to make the right decisions? Consider adding communication to your list of key variables to track. Improving your communication efforts can dramatically improve your overall organizational success. You've had the training now to lead this effort. You know the impact communication can have, and you have the 7 questions to lead you to success. Best of luck.